Ancient Greek comedy was one of the final three principal dramatic forms in the theatre of classical Greece. The philosopher Aristotle wrote in his Poetics, circa 335 BC, that comedy is a representation of laughable people and involves some kind of blunder or ugliness which does not cause pain or disaster. For ancient Greeks and Romans, a comedy was a stage play with a happy ending. In the Middle Ages, the term expanded to include narrative poems with happy endings and a lighter tone. In this sense, Dante used the term in the title of his poem, The Divine Comedy. In Italian, it is Divina Commedia. The phenomena connected with laughter and that which provokes it has been carefully investigated by psychologists and agreed upon. The predominating characteristics are incongruity and contrast in the object and shock or emotional seizure on the part of the subject. Much comedy contains variations on the elements of surprise, incongruity, conflict, repetitiveness, and the effect of opposite expectations, but there are many recognized genres of comedy. Satire and political satire use ironic comedy used to portray persons or social institutions as ridiculous or corrupt, thus alienating their audience from the object of humor. Parody borrows the form of some popular genre, artwork, or text but uses certain ironic changes to critique that form from within. Screwball comedy derives its humor largely from bizarre, surprising, and improbable situations or characters. Black comedy is defined by dark humor that makes light of so called dark or evil elements in human nature. Similarly, scatological humor, sexual humor, and race humor create comedy by violating social conventions or taboos in comedic ways. A comedy of manners typically takes as its subject a particular part of society, usually upper class society, and uses humor to parody or satirize the behavior and mannerisms of its members. Romantic comedy is a popular genre that depicts burgeoning romance in humorous terms and focuses on the fables of those who are falling in love. The word comedy is derived from the classical Greek komodia, which is a compound of komos, which means revel, and oid, that is singing ode. The Greeks and Romans confined the use of the word comedy to descriptions of stage plays with happy endings. As time progressed, the word came more and more to be associated with any sort of performance intended to cause laughter. During the Middle Ages, the term comedy became synonymous with satire and later with humor in general. After the Latin translations of the 12th century, the term comedy gained a more general meaning in medieval literature. In the late 20th century, many scholars preferred to use the term laughter to refer to the whole gamut of the comic in order to avoid the use of ambiguous and problematically defined genres such as the grotesque, irony, and satire. The Alexandrine grammarians, and most likely Aristophanes of Byzantium in particular, seem to have been the first to divide Greek comedy into what became the canonical three periods: Old Comedy, Archaea, middle comedy Messe, and new comedy Nia. These divisions appear to be largely arbitrary, and ancient comedy almost certainly developed constantly over the years. Western history of comedy. Starting from 425 BCE, Aristophanes, a comic playwright and satirical author of the ancient Greek theatre, wrote 40 comedies, 11 of which survive. Aristotle taught that comedy was generally positive for society since it brings forth happiness, which for Aristotle was the ideal state, the final goal in any activity. A comedy is about the fortunate rise of a sympathetic character. Aristotle divides comedy into three categories or subgenres: farce, romantic comedy, and satire. Aristotle defined comedy as one of the original four genres of literature. Comedies begin with low or base characters seeking insignificant aims and end with some accomplishment of the aims, which either lightens the initial baseness or reveals the insignificance of the aims. Old comedy. The most important old comic dramatist is Aristophanes, born in 446 BC. His work, with their pungent political satire and abundance of sexual and scatological innuendo, effectively define the genre today. Aristophanes lampooned the most important personalities and institutions of his day, as can be seen, for example, in his buffoonish portrayal of Socrates in The Clouds and in his racy anti-war farce Lysistrata. He was one of a large number of comic poets working in Athens in the late 5th century, his most important contemporary rivals being Hermippus and Eupolis. The Old Comedy subsequently influenced later European writers such as Rabelais, Cervantes, Swift, and Voltaire. In particular, they copied the technique of disguising a political attack as buffoonery. Middle comedy. The line between old and middle comedy is not clearly marked chronologically. Aristophanes and others of the latest writers of the old comedy being sometimes regarded as the earliest middle comic poets. Middle comedy is generally seen as differing from old comedy in three essential particulars. The role of the chorus was diminished to the point where it had no influence on the plot. Public characters were not impersonated or personified on stage, and the objects of ridicule were general rather than personal, literary rather than political, for at least a time. Mythological burlesque was popular among the middle comic poets. Stock characters of all sorts also emerge: courtesans, parasites, revelers, philosophers, boastful soldiers, and especially the conceited cook with his parade of culinary science. Because no middle comic plays have been preserved, it is impossible to offer any real assessment of their literary value or genius. But many middle comic plays appear to have been revived in Sicily and Magna Graecia, in this period, suggesting that they had considerable widespread literary and social influence. New Comedy followed the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC and lasted throughout the reign of the Macedonian rulers, ending about 260 BC. The three best known playwrights belonging to this genre are Menander, Philemon, and Diphilus. The playwrights of the New Comedy genre built on the legacy from their predecessors but adapted it to the portrayal of everyday life rather than of public affairs. The new comedians preferred the everyday world to mythological themes, coincidences to miracles or metamorphoses, and they peopled this world with a whole series of semi realistic braggarts, the permissive father figure, and the stern father, young lovers, parasites, kind hearted prostitutes, and cunning servants. Their largely gentle comedy of manners drew on a vast array of dramatic devices, characters, and situations their predecessors had developed, prologues to shape the audience's understanding of events, messenger speeches to announce offstage action, description of feasts, the complications of love, sudden recognitions, ex machina endings were all established techniques which playwrights exploited and evoked. The new comedy depicted Athenian society and the social morality of the period, presenting it in attractive colors but making no attempt to criticize or improve it. In his own time, Philemon was perhaps the most successful among the new comedy, regularly beating the younger figure of Menander in contests, but the latter would be the most highly esteemed by subsequent generations. Menander's comedies not only provide their audience with brief respite from reality, but also gave audiences an accurate picture of life. Menander's comedies tended to center on the fears and foibles of the ordinary man, his personal relationships, family life, and social mishaps, rather than politics and political life. His plays were also much less satirical than preceding comedies, being marked by a gentle, urbane tone, a taste for good temper and good manners. The human dimension of his characters was one of the strengths of Menander's plays and perhaps his greatest legacy through his use of these fairly stereotyped characters to comment on human life and depict human folly and absurdity compassionately with wit and subtlety. Much of the rest of our knowledge of New Comedy is derived from the Latin adaptations of Plautus and Terence. Influences. Horace claimed Menander as a model for his own gentle brand of Roman satire. The New Comedy influenced much of Western European literature, primarily through Plautus and Terence, in particular the comic drama of Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, Congreve and Wycherley, and in France, Molière. The five-act structure, later to be found in modern plays, can first be seen in Menander's comedies, wherein comedies of previous generations there were choral interludes, there was dialogue with song, the action of his plays had breaks, the situations in them were conventional and coincidences were convenient, thus showing the smooth and effective development of his plays. Much of contemporary romantic and situational comedy descends from the new comedy's sensibility, in particular generational comedies such as All in the Family and Meet the Parents. In the modern sense, comedy is a genre of fiction that refers to any discourse of work generally intended to be humorous or amusing by including laughter, especially in theater, television, film, stand up comedy, books, or any other medium of entertainment. Early Renaissance forms of comedy. The Divine Comedy is a long narrative poem by Dante Alighieri, begun in circa 1308 and completed in 1320, a year before his death in 1321. It is widely considered to be one of the greatest works of world literature. The work was originally simplified titled Commedia. The adjective divina was added by Giovanni Boccaccio. Comedy in its Elizabethan usage had a very different meaning from modern comedy. A Shakespearean comedy is one that has a happy ending, usually involving marriages between the unmarried characters, and a tone and style that is more light-hearted than Shakespeare's other plays. 19th to early 20th century. In early 19th century England, pantomime acquired its present form, which includes slapstick comedy and featured the first mainstream clown, Joseph Grimaldi, while comedy routines also featured heavily in British music hall theatre, which became popular in the 1850s. British comedians who honed their skills in music hall sketches include Charlie Chaplin, Stan Laurel, and Dan Leno. 20th century theatre and art. Surreal humor, also known as absurdist humor or surreal comedy, is a form of humor predicated on deliberate violations of casual reasoning, producing events and behaviors that are obviously illogical. The humor arises from a subversion of audiences' expectations so that amusement is founded on unpredictability, separate from a logical analysis of the situation. The humor derived gets its appeal from the ridiculousness and unlikeliness of the situation. The genre has roots in surrealism in the arts. Surreal humor is the effect of illogic and absurdity being used for humorous effect. Under such premises, people can identify precursors and early examples of surreal humor, at least since the 19th century, such as Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, which both use illogic and absurdity, hookah smoking caterpillars, croquet matches using live flamingos as mollets, etc., for humorous effect. Many of Edward Lear's children's stories and poems contain nonsense are basically surreal in approach. Non-Western history of comedy. By 200 BC, in ancient Sanskrit drama, Bharat Muni's Natya Shastra defined humor, hasyam, as one of the 9 nerve ras or principal ras, means emotional responses, which can be inspired by the audience by bhavs, the imitation of emotions that the actors perform. Each ras was associated with a specific bhav portrayed on stage. In the case of humor, it was associated with mirth, that is, hasya. Comedy may be divided into multiple genres based on the source of humor, the method of delivery, and the context in which it is delivered. The different forms of comedy often overlap, and most comedy can fit into multiple genres. Some of the subgenres of comedy are farce, comedy of manners, burlesque, and satire. Self-deprecation is a technique of comedy used by many comedians who focus on their misfortunes and foibles in order to entertain.